The sun rose gently over the small town of Everwood, its rays spilling through half-drawn curtains and touching the face of a woman who hadn't smiled in years. Martha Jenkins sat in her worn recliner near the window, the same spot she'd claimed since her husband died decades ago. Though the light poured in golden and soft, her heart remained cold, untouched by warmth, untouched by grace. Neighbors had long given up trying to know her. To them, she was that old woman at the end of Birch Lane, the one who barely spoke, never waved, and frowned at children who dared to play too loudly near her yard. Her mailbox overflowed sometimes because she didn't care to check it. Even when Pastor Bennett came knocking from the local church, she would pretend not to hear. In truth, she heard everything. She just didn't want to be reminded of a God she had long stopped believing in. At 68, Martha's face carried the lines of grief that time hadn't softened. Her eyes were sharp, her tone harsher still. She'd spent decades perfecting the art of keeping people at a distance. Not out of pride, but out of pain. The world had failed her too many times, and she had sworn never to let it close enough to do so again. Martha's bitterness wasn't born overnight. It had roots, deep, twisted roots buried in childhood memories she never spoke of. She was the daughter of a young woman named Lila, and a man who wanted nothing to do with her before she was even born. Her father had denied her existence. The shame, the whispers, the judgment, it all fell on her mother. And when Lila remarried a man named Henry Jenkins, Martha thought maybe things would be different. But Henry saw her not as a child to love, but as an inconvenience to punish. He was cruel when drunk, and drunk most of the time. As a little girl, Martha would lie in bed praying. Not for toys, not for birthdays, but for quiet, for peace, for her stepfather not to come into her room. But her prayers went unanswered, or so she thought, and the silence of heaven became, to her, proof that even God had turned away. By the time she was 14, Martha had stopped talking much. Her mother told her to keep quiet, be grateful, and don't ruin a good marriage. The words sliced deeper than the belt Henry used. She hated her mother for that. She hated her stepfather for every night he made her feel small. And she hated the father she'd never met for setting her life on fire before she was even born. She carried that hatred like armor, heavy, cold, and unbreakable. Decades passed. Martha grew up, left home, and swore she'd never marry, never have children, never trust a soul. She worked at the same factory for 30 years, quiet and efficient. The other women would talk about their husbands, their children, church picnics, and Sunday services. Martha would roll her eyes and mutter under her breath, "If God's so good, why'd he give me the life he did?" When her co-workers invited her to church events, she'd scoff. Church folk only smile on Sundays. The rest of the week, they lie like everyone else. That was how she justified her loneliness, by convincing herself she didn't need anyone. Her bitterness became her companion. It protected her, it excused her, it filled every silence. But in her quiet home, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and fading photos of a mother she never forgave, the bitterness started to turn into something else, emptiness. And for years she carried that emptiness until she met him, a man named Harold. Harold was quiet, kind in the simplest ways, a co-worker from the factory who used to bring her coffee during lunch breaks without expecting conversation. He never pushed, never asked questions, and for a while, Martha found comfort in his quiet presence. They married when she was 32, not out of romance, but because he made the world feel less heavy. For a short while, she thought maybe God had finally remembered her. Harold never raised his voice, never hurt her. He planted flowers outside their small home, and on Sundays he'd leave for church, always asking, "Will you come with me this time?" She never did. Then, after only 5 years of marriage, Harold collapsed one morning on his way to work. A heart attack. Gone before she could even say goodbye. The grief was unbearable. Not because she had loved deeply, but because he had been the only person who didn't make her feel cursed. And when he died, something inside her snapped. "If that's what love brings," she'd said at the funeral, "then I don't want it." Not from man, not from God. From that day forward she swore off both. And her heart, already wounded, hardened into stone. At night, she sometimes heard the old church bells ring across town, and wondered if anyone ever prayed for her. But the thought made her angry, so she pushed it away. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone rang, a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. Martha almost ignored it, but something told her to pick up. "Hello." Her voice was flat. "Ms. Jenkins." It was a woman's voice, soft and unfamiliar. "This is Sister Elaine from the First Baptist Church. I'm calling because your neighbor, Miss Ruth, asked if we could deliver meals to you on Thursdays. We have a senior fellowship program." "I don't need charity," Martha snapped, cutting her off. "Tell Miss Ruth to mind her business." There was silence on the line. Then the woman spoke gently. "It's not charity, dear. It's love. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we're not alone." Martha hung up without another word. But for some reason those words, "You're not alone," wouldn't leave her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her dreams were restless. Flashes of her stepfather's shadow, her mother's silence, her own younger self crying into a pillow that never answered back. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears. By the end of that week, the loneliness pressed so heavy that Martha turned on her old TV, just for noise. A preacher's voice filled the room, low, steady, sincere. "You can't heal what you refuse to feel. You can't forgive if you never face it. But the Lord is still waiting, still ready to take that burden." Martha froze. Something in that voice reached through the walls she'd built. The preacher read a verse that made her chest ache. Psalm 34 verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." She stared at the screen. Her lips trembled. "No," she whispered. "He wasn't close to me. Not then." But her heart wouldn't let her change the channel. That night, for the first time in over 40 years, Martha whispered a prayer. Not a pretty one, just raw words spilling from a weary heart. "God, if you're real, if you ever cared, why'd you let it happen? Why me?" No answer came. No light filled the room. Just silence. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt patient. Somewhere deep inside her, something began to stir, small, fragile, but alive. And though she didn't know it yet, that tiny stirring was the beginning of her healing. The following Thursday, the knock came again. 3 slow taps at the door. Patient, polite, persistent. Martha froze, the way she always did when someone invaded her quiet. She ignored it the first time. The second time, she raised her voice. "I told you people, I don't need visitors." But the knocking didn't stop. Finally, she opened the door just enough to peek through. A woman stood there holding a brown paper bag that smelled of chicken stew and cornbread. She had silver hair tied back in a bun, and kind eyes that didn't flinch beneath Martha's glare. "Good afternoon," the woman said softly. "I'm Sister Elaine, we spoke on the phone." Martha's frown deepened. "I said I didn't need anything." "I know," Elaine replied with a small smile. "But I brought this anyway. It's homemade. You don't have to eat it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes, they carried a strength Martha hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet, unyielding kind of love. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The only sound was the wind brushing past the old screen door. Finally, Martha sighed. "You can leave it there." Elaine nodded, set the bag on the porch step, and smiled again. "All right. I'll see you next week then." Martha blinked. "I didn't agree to that." "I know," Elaine said. "But I'll come anyway. The Lord put you on my heart." And before Martha could protest, the woman turned and walked away. The smell of cornbread lingered for hours. Martha told herself she wouldn't touch it. But as the evening shadows grew longer, and her stomach grumbled louder, she finally gave in. The food was warm, comforting. She hated that it comforted her. When she went to bed that night, she dreamed of her mother, younger, tired, holding a crying child in her arms. The child's face was her own. When she woke, the pillow was wet again. The next Thursday, Sister Elaine came again. and the Thursday after that. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes she just brought a smile. Each time, she said the same thing before leaving. God hasn't forgotten you, Martha. At first, Martha bristled every time she heard it. But one afternoon, after Elaine mentioned a small Bible study for older women at the church, something inside her softened. Just enough for curiosity to sneak in. I'm not religious, Martha warned. Elaine smiled. Neither were half of us when we started. There was no pressure in her voice, no judgment, just invitation. And so, one Sunday morning, Martha found herself standing outside the white wooden doors of First Baptist Church of Everwood, clutching her purse as if it were armor. The sanctuary smelled of lilies and lemon polish. The sound of gospel music floated softly through the air. Not the loud, showy kind Martha always hated, but something tender and sincere. The women gathered there were around her age, gray-haired, laughing quietly, holding hands as they prayed. Sister Elaine motioned her over. Ladies, this is Martha. They smiled at her as if she'd been part of them forever. One of them, a woman named Bernice, reached out to hug her. Martha stiffened, but didn't pull away. We're glad you're here, sweetheart, Bernice said gently. It was such a simple thing to say, but the word sweetheart pierced something in Martha's chest. She hadn't been called that since she was a little girl. She nodded awkwardly and sat down. That day's study was about forgiveness. The leader, a soft-spoken woman named Ruby, read aloud from the book of Matthew. Matthew 6 verses 14 to 15. For if ye forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if ye forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Martha stared at the page, the words blurring. She felt heat rise in her chest, anger, resentment, grief all at once. Forgive. Forgive a man who stole my childhood? A mother who stood by and did nothing? A father who never wanted me? Her fists clenched in her lap. She wanted to walk out, but something, some invisible hand, held her still. When the study ended, Ruby said, Forgiveness isn't saying what they did was right. It's saying you won't let it own you anymore. Martha froze. The words hit like thunder. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but instead she sat there trembling. That was the first time in decades she felt God speaking to her heart. That night she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every hurt she'd buried began to surface. Faces, names, rooms she hadn't dared to remember. She saw herself as a little girl again, pleading silently for help that never came. And she wept loud, raw, unguarded sobs that echoed through her small house. Between tears she whispered, God, I don't know how to forgive them, but I can't live like this anymore. She reached for the Bible Sister Elaine had given her and opened it at random. Her eyes landed on this verse. Isaiah 61 verse 3. To appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. The words blurred through her tears, but she read them again and again. Beauty for ashes. Could God really do that? Even for her? When dawn came, Martha fell to her knees beside her bed. Her voice cracked, but she spoke anyway. God, I've hated for so long. I've hated you, my mother, my father, everyone. I don't know how to let it go. But I'm tired. Please teach me how. The room was quiet. Yet somehow she felt less alone. It was the first honest prayer of her life, and heaven heard it. Days later, Martha joined the women again. They prayed together, sang softly, and shared testimonies of pain and restoration. For the first time she spoke. Barely a whisper at first, but it grew steadier with each word. I used to think God forgot me, she said, voice trembling. But maybe he was waiting for me to come out of hiding. Tears filled the room. Sister Elaine reached over and took her hand. Martha didn't know what to call it then, but in that moment, something broke open inside her. Not in destruction, but release. She had met God not in anger, but in mercy. And from that day on, the walls around her heart began to crumble, one prayer at a time. The days that followed Martha's first prayer of surrender were strangely quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet she'd known before, but a stillness that seemed to make space for something new. For the first time in years, she woke with a sense of purpose. She found herself humming old hymns she hadn't heard since childhood, her voice rough but tender. The women's fellowship became a lifeline. Every week, they met in the small church basement, the room always smelling faintly of coffee and lilies, and shared their stories. Some spoke of children who no longer called, some of husbands who'd left or died, and some, like Martha, of wounds carried since childhood. Each time, Sister Elaine would close the meeting by reminding them, "We heal when we share. We forgive when we speak." Martha wasn't sure she believed that yet, but she could feel something loosening inside her, like chains beginning to rust. One afternoon after fellowship, Martha lingered outside while the others chatted. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue brushed with clouds. Elaine joined her quietly. "You look heavy today," she said gently. Martha nodded. "I've been thinking about my mother." Elaine waited. "She's buried not far from here," Martha continued. "I haven't visited her grave since the funeral. I told myself she didn't deserve my forgiveness." Elaine smiled softly. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about what they deserve, but what you deserve, peace." Those words sank deep. 2 days later, Martha took the long walk to the cemetery on the hill. Her knees ached, and the wind bit at her face, but she didn't turn back. When she finally stood before the old stone-marked Lila Jenkins, 1915 to 1987, she felt her chest tighten. She didn't cry right away. She just stood there, hands trembling, heart pounding, memories rushing like water through a broken dam. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you protect me?" The wind rustled the trees, carrying away her question. She sank to her knees, pressing her palm to the cold stone. "I hated you," she said through tears. "All these years I've hated you. But I think you were broken too, weren't you? You were scared. You thought silence kept peace." Her voice broke. "I forgive you, Mama. I forgive you." She stayed there until the sun began to fade, her sobs softening into prayer. Ephesians 4 verses 31 to 32. "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." As she spoke those words aloud, a strange peace settled over her. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something greater. The next week, Martha sat at her kitchen table with a sheet of paper before her. The old wooden clock ticked softly on the wall. She took a deep breath and began to write. "To my father, I don't know if you're still alive, and I don't even know your face. But I carried your rejection all my life, as if it were my name. I thought if you didn't want me, I wasn't worth wanting. But I know now that wasn't true. God wanted me before I was ever born. He knew my name when you refused to. I forgive you, not because you asked for it, but because I need to breathe again." When she finished, she folded the letter and held it to her chest. For a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to hand it to him, to look into his eyes and see the man who had shaped her pain. Then she lit a candle, set the letter beside it, and prayed. "Lord, let this be the last time I carry this weight." When the flame touched the paper and it turned to ash, she whispered, "Beauty for ashes. You promised." Forgiving her stepfather was harder. His face was the one that haunted her most. The cruelty, the threats, the smell of whiskey and fear. They lived in her memory like stains that wouldn't fade. She didn't know how to forgive a man who had done such things. So she asked God. One morning, during prayer at the fellowship, she heard Ruby read another verse. Romans 12 verse 19. "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." The word struck her deeply. She realized she had been holding vengeance in her heart all her life, carrying it like a torch that burned her more than anyone else. So that afternoon, she went to the edge of the woods behind her home, where a small stream flowed softly. She carried a small rock in her hand, heavy and rough. "This," she whispered, "is what I've carried." And she threw it into the water. The splash was small, but in her spirit, it felt like thunder. "God," she said softly, "you deal with him. I'm done." She closed her eyes and felt the cool breeze wrap around her like a gentle embrace. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, people began to notice a change in Martha. She smiled more, laughed softly, and even greeted children who passed her house. At the next Bible study, she shared her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had finally laid her burden down. "I spent my whole life hating everyone who hurt me," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "But hate was just another kind of prison. And I didn't even realize the key had been in my hand all along, forgiveness." The room was silent, some women wiping tears. Sister Elaine took her hand and whispered, "That's freedom, Martha. That's what grace feels like." Martha smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, she felt light, not because her past had changed, but because her heart finally had. As she walked home that evening, the church bell rang across Everwood, the same bell she'd once resented. Now its sound felt different, almost like a melody of redemption. She looked up at the sky, painted in soft pinks and golds, and whispered the verse that had carried her this far. Romans 8 verse 28. "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." She smiled through tears. "All things," she said softly. "Even this." Weeks turned into months, and the church became her second home. Martha started volunteering with the women's ministry, visiting shut-ins, and helping younger women who carried their own silent pain. Each time someone said, "You're such a blessing," Martha would laugh and reply, "If you'd met me before God found me, you wouldn't say that." But deep inside she was grateful. Grateful that the God she once hated had loved her too much to let her stay that way. The following spring in Everwood came earlier than usual. The air smelled of rain and lilacs, and the town, once gray with winter, now glowed with color. Martha sat on the front porch of her small house, a Bible resting on her lap, and a cup of tea steaming beside her. The same chair where she'd once scowled at the world had now become her place of peace. Birds sang on the fence line, children's laughter drifted from across the street, and for the first time in her life, Martha didn't feel like the world was moving without her. She was part of it, calm, content, forgiven. On Wednesdays, she met with her circle of sisters at the church. Women who, like her, had lived long enough to know that life doesn't always go the way you dream, but that God has a way of turning ashes into beauty. They called themselves the Grace Circle. Not officially, but that's what the name felt like. Sister Elaine was still there, faithful as ever. Ruby, Bernice, and a few newcomers joined weekly, each bringing food, laughter, and sometimes tears. One day, Ruby asked Martha to lead the group in a short devotion. Martha hesitated at first, but Elaine placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You have something we all need, a story that proves God doesn't forget his daughters." So Martha agreed. That evening, as the women gathered, she opened her Bible and spoke with the slow confidence of someone who had wrestled with God and come out whole. "When I was younger," she began, "I thought God's silence meant he didn't care. I thought pain was proof of abandonment. But now I know, his silence was mercy. It kept me alive until I was ready to hear him." She paused, voice trembling slightly. "I carried hate so long that I forgot what peace felt like. But forgiveness is God's gift to the wounded. It doesn't excuse what was done. It heals what was broken." She turned to her Bible and read aloud. Philippians 4 verse 7. "And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." As the words filled the room, a hush fell over the women. Some wept quietly. Others reached out to hold hands. Martha smiled softly. "If you're still waiting for peace, don't give up. God's not finished with you yet. He wasn't finished with me either." A few months later, a letter arrived, addressed to Martha Jenkins. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. She opened it cautiously. It was from a man named Walter Dyer, her father. He was 87 now, living in a nursing home 2 towns over. He wrote that he'd spent his life regretting how he treated her mother, how he'd turned away out of fear and pride. He'd never married, never had other children. And now, near the end of his life, he wanted to meet her, if she was willing. Martha sat at her table for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. A year ago, she would have torn it to shreds. But now she felt only stillness. That night she prayed, "Lord, if this is part of my healing, help me walk into it with grace." 2 weeks later, she stood at the entrance of the nursing home, hands trembling as she signed in. The nurse led her down a quiet hallway to a small room. There he was, an old man, frail, his face lined with age and remorse. He looked up slowly, eyes filling with tears the moment he saw her. "Martha," he whispered. She nodded. "Yes, it's me." He tried to stand, but his body betrayed him. She hurried forward, helping him sit back. "I'm so sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I was a coward. I didn't know how to be a father. I thought staying away would make things easier. But it only made me empty." Martha's throat tightened. She had imagined this moment for decades, shouting, blaming, accusing. But now, none of that seemed necessary. "God already forgave you," she said softly. "And so have I." The man began to weep, his shoulders shaking. She reached out and held his hand, the hand she had hated for most of her life. And for the first time, she felt nothing but compassion. That afternoon, she stayed for hours, listening to him talk about his regrets, his youth, his loneliness. When she left, she kissed his forehead and said, "Rest, Daddy. You can go in peace now." A few weeks later, Martha shared the story of that visit during the church's Sunday morning service. The sanctuary was filled with light filtering through stained glass, painting her face in hues of gold and rose. She stood at the pulpit, her voice steady, her eyes bright. "I used to think my story was one of pain," she said, "but now I see it was one of preparation. God let me walk through darkness so I could help others find light." She opened her Bible one last time and read Isaiah 43 verses 18 to 19. "Remember ye not the former things, neither consider the things of old. Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." Her voice trembled with joy as she continued, "I lived my whole life angry, at my parents, at God, at myself. But God didn't punish me for it. He waited. He waited for the day I'd stop running and start healing. And when I did, He met me right where I was, in my old age, with all my scars, and He said, 'You're still my daughter.'" The congregation rose to their feet, some clapping, some crying. Pastor Bennett, who had once stood at her door and been turned away, walked forward and hugged her. "You just preached a sermon better than I ever could," he said with a smile. From that day on, Martha's life became a quiet ministry. She didn't need a title, a pulpit, or recognition. Her home became a safe place for hurting women, widows, single mothers, even younger women burdened by guilt and shame. She listened more than she spoke, prayed more than she complained, and loved without fear. Her favorite verse hung framed by her front door. Isaiah 61 verse 3. "To give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." Visitors always stopped to read it. Martha would smile and say, "That verse saved me." Years later, one quiet morning, the women from her fellowship arrived to find her Bible open on the table, a cup of tea beside it, and sunlight pouring across the page she'd been reading. It was Psalm 73 verse 26. "My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Martha had gone home, not in sorrow but in peace. At her memorial, the church was filled with people whose lives she'd touched. Sister Elaine spoke last, her voice warm but trembling. "Martha used to think she hated everyone," she said. "But in the end, she showed us all what love really looks like, the kind that forgives, heals, and endures." The congregation sang softly, "It is well with my soul." And as the melody rose, sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting the church in colors of gold and grace, as if heaven itself was smiling. Months later, the Grace Circle renamed their group Martha's Table. They continued meeting, praying, and sharing meals, because that was what she would have wanted. And every new member who joined heard her story, the woman who hated everyone, until God met her in her old age. Her story spread quietly beyond Everwood, passed from woman to woman, each whispering the same words she'd once said. It's never too late to heal. And somewhere in the hearts of countless women who thought they were forgotten, Martha's voice still echoed, gentle,